Okay, hello and welcome. Thank you all for joining us today for this webinar, which is the launch of Principle 8, Be Responsive. I'm really excited for this webinar. My name is Ben Carpenter. I'm Chief Executive of SVI International, and I'm delighted to be delivering this webinar alongside Jenni. Jenni, say hello and introduce yourself, please.
Hi, I'm Jenni Inglis. I'm co-chair of the SVI International Methodology Sub-Committee.
Wonderful. Thank you for joining me today, Jenni. I know we've both worked extremely hard on this with many others, so it's a great moment to be sharing with everyone. Thank you for delivering with us. So yeah, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Let's get into it. You're all here to find out a little bit more about the new principles. So I have some slides and I'm just going to share my screen. Can I get a thumbs up or a yes if you can see my screen? Great. Okay. So we will have plenty of time for questions and discussion later, but we've got an agenda which I'll talk through in a moment. Just some basic housekeeping. I've already mentioned this is being recorded. The recording will be made available on SVI's YouTube channel. It'll be in the members area and sent to all attendees. If you don't want to be on the recording, please turn your camera off. And yeah, please think about some questions. A discussion can be had at the end. You can feel free to use the chat or speak at the end as well. So we've done the welcome. We're going to dive into an introduction and overview to Principle 8 that me and Jenni will provide. We'll talk briefly about next steps and then, as I say, go into the Q&A and the discussion. So here it is, lovely and shiny and beautifully presented. Thanks to Heidi, everyone who's got this published, and it's now available on the website. This is a document that includes the new standard on applying Principle 8, Be Responsive. And in that document, you'll see two things. Well, as well as an introduction, it actually sets out the SVI standard for applying Principle 8, Be Responsive, and we'll get into that, what that is in a moment. Jenni will talk us through that. And it also has some guidance on how people can work towards meeting this standard. So I do hope you've all downloaded it. It's available on the website, and yeah, I hope it's useful. I want to kind of pause and just recognize that this is a really important day and a really important milestone for SVI and for all of us to have this new principle launched officially today and this new standard. I think it's not every day that this happens. You know, we're an organization that work collaboratively to set these standards, and it takes a long time. And Jenni will probably testify to that. You know, each time we produce one of these standards, it goes through public consultation, lots of drafts, and the methodology subcommittee make comments and give a recommendation to the SVI board before it becomes published. And Principle 8 is a new one, and it's the next slide shows a bit of an evolution of the principles, and I thought it's worth just doing that just to kind of recognize the journey of this set of principles and why this is quite an important moment. I've started the timeline right back in 2007 when the 7 social value principles were first published and released to the world with the guide to SRI, which was published by what's now known as Social Value UK, formerly the SRI network. And this is when the social value principles were born, if you like. They started their circulation around the world, people engaging with them, adopting them. And in 2014, there was an important moment when the social value principles were adopted by SVI, Social Value International, as it became known then, and the global community of networks and chapters around the world that wanted to adopt these 7 principles. There was a small change at that point where Principle 3 for Value What Matters was adapted to allow for non-monetary valuation, whereas previously it was always about using money to represent the value of social outcomes and impact. So that was a bit of a change. And ever since then, there hasn't been any significant changes to the principles themselves. It was only in 2020 that an SVI member submitted a letter to the SVI board requesting and calling for the introduction of this 8th principle, be responsive. And so this triggered a lot of discussions with the SVI board and the Methodology Subcommittee, discussing the pros and cons and the implications of having this new 8th principle. In the end, we decided that it was the right thing to do, and the Methodology Subcommittee throughout 2021 produced some drafts. Very grateful for Jenni, who did a lot of the thought leadership in drafting these versions, and we carried out public consultation with all of you as members and the wider public. And really, one of the things that I think is important, we might talk about later, is that through the creation of this document and this standard about being responsive, it also led SVI to think about, well, what is the purpose of the principles of social value more generally? And what is the purpose of the SVI standards? What are they designed to do? And that led to the publication of another document that you may have read. I hope you have. And if you haven't, I'll share the link. And this was published in March, which really underlined the purpose of the principles. And that helped with the finalization of this 8th principle, be responsive, which was published just today. So I hope you forgive me for that little history lesson in terms of how the principles have evolved. But I think it's important to recognize that there's been a lot that's happened to date. Enough from me. I want to hand over to Jenni and say, well, what does be responsive actually mean? So over to you, Jenni.
Great. Well, I'm going to start by talking about the purpose of the standards, which, as Ben's already described, we've used this development of the 8th principle and the standard around how to apply the 8th principle as a way to refresh as well. Also, what's the point of the principles and what are we trying to achieve? And so you can see on a dark blue background here on this slide, the purpose that we've come up with is to optimize impact on well-being of all material affected stakeholders. So it's the well-being of all the stakeholders that are materially affected through decision making that's timely and supported by appropriate accounting and reporting. So a bit of a mouthful, but the key focus here is on the purpose is really on optimizing well-being of materially affected stakeholders of any set of activities or organization. And there's been, one of the things was quite a lot of discussion around why optimizing, and we'll maybe come to that a little bit later, but that's the overall purpose of it. And then what we've got sitting underneath that is that you have to implement a management approach, and that there's 3 elements to this management approach, where it's looking at 3 different types of decisions that you might make. One is strategic, so the highest level decisions. So what is it that your organization is trying to achieve in the world? And that can be both to improve the world and also to make the impacts, lessen negative impacts on well-being of stakeholders. Tactical, so the strategic decisions are really the big things that could make a very significant difference. So it might even be a total change of direction for an organization. That would be at the level of strategic, or it might be aligning around an existing strategy. Tactical, choosing activities that best achieve the goals. So once you've set what the goals are, both in terms of what you're trying to achieve positively and negative impacts that you're trying to reduce, how best to achieve that. And then operational decisions. So, and this is mostly in the category of making improvements to existing activities. And the reason that we've set it out like that is that we didn't want it to all end up with making small tweaks. So the decisions, we want the decisions that organizations are making to be carefully considered, not just in terms of how can we make things a little bit better, how can we get kind of incremental change for and improvements on the well-being of stakeholders, but actually how can we make better choices between options and then how can we make better choices of what it is that we're trying to achieve. And so the management approach has to include scheduling of decision making. So it's no use waiting to make a decision, you know, and we can see this playing out with climate change at the moment. You know, delays in decision making are having very serious effects on whether we're actually going to be able to achieve the limit in the warming effect on the planet. So actually timely decisions are important, and that this needs to be backed up with a set of social value accounts that are done to an appropriate degree of rigor, and there's more on rigor in a minute, and external reporting for accountability, so that people can actually understand and follow the important aspects of the decisions that you're making, and hold you to account in the case that they disagree on the extent to which you are meeting your objectives. So that's it in a nutshell.
It is a fantastic nutshell. Thanks, Jenny. I really like that 3 types of decisions that you described, you know, because we often talk about decision making, but this is a kind of great way of saying, well, there are so many different types of decisions, and that's a really nice framing for the implication. So, Jenny, how much do you think this is a departure from SVI? Is it taking us into new territory? What do you think?
Well, luckily I agree with this slide, which says, in some ways it's not much of a departure. So I think the thing with this is we had always intended, so, you know, so I've been around since the very beginning of this whole thing, when we were developing the 7 principles, which were originally the 7 principles of social return on investment, and then that's been expanded and applied to social value. And I think when we were developing those, there was always the intention that you would actually do something different. So it wasn't just about you would do a good attempt at social value accounting, and then you'd say, oh, that's great, we'll put that report in a file somewhere, or we'll wave it around to try and get some more money, or we'll, you know, the intention was never just that you stop with the accounting. You don't stop with financial accounting on the, well, we've done the accounts now, right, what's next? You look at what does it mean, and you analyze it, and you think, how do I make better decisions? How do I optimize my business? So why would you not apply the same kind of logic to the social value accounting, social value, accounting for social value? Why wouldn't you do the same thing? But what we actually saw in practice was that wasn't really happening. And so I think part of the genesis of developing this principle was to make it more explicit that actually you do need to do something on the back of the accounts, and that also probably where you want to focus on the degree and the quality of the accounts depends to some extent on what it is you're trying to achieve, and where the significant impacts in the system are. And so that means that, and this is where it's different. So I've just said, well, it's kind of not a departure, because it's kind of what everybody that was involved at the outset had always intended would happen. And all we're doing here is really making something that was implicit explicit, and that has meant that we've had to surface what was in people's minds, and try and put it on paper and try and agree on it, which is always, you know, always a good exercise. And then in some ways it's different, because what we've done with Principle 8 and what Principle 8 required us to do was to think through some things that maybe were kind of unresolved issues from the first 7 principles. And one of them, I think, is this point about rigor. And I've already said there's another slide on rigor, so we'll get to that in a minute. We've thought about rigor maybe we've clarified what we're meaning by rigor in maybe a slightly different way to how we've expressed it in the past, and hopefully that's going to be helpful to users of the standard. And then we've also had to think about things like targets and thresholds, because what's really good enough in terms of optimizing impact on well-being is a big question. If you're actually trying to be responsive to societal needs, then you know how fast you act is important. How much of how intensively you act can be very important as well. You know, so for example, you know, I think a lot of people will have seen the analysis of people being moved. You have to think about homelessness, people being moved around the system rather than actually being helped out, you know, rather than there ever being an actual significant change in their state and their level of well-being. So it introduces things like targets and thresholds and risks that we hadn't really grappled with on paper in any of the other principles, and it will mean that we will need to work back and revise and adjust some of the, or add a little bit to some of the other principles as well.
Indeed. Yeah, excellent. And so that much awaited slide on Rigor, because you used it a few times. So tell us how we're talking about it now then.
Yeah, so I think one of the things to say about this is that quite often when people use the word rigor in the context of impact, of understanding the positive and negative effects that you're having on society, they will talk about it meaning really how good is your counterfactual, how good is your dead weight, how good is your assessment of what would have happened anyway. And it's that kind of accuracy aspect of have you actually nailed down that what you're claiming, the positive thing you're claiming is as a result of the thing that you've done. How sure are you of that? And that's obviously important. In some contexts it's extremely important, but I think what it lacks is and why we've added this aspect of completeness, and this is really in line with the intention and the essence of the first 7 principles from day one, was that actually what we're trying to achieve is that you're not sort of narrowing, you're not only looking at one part of the effect that you're having on the world, that you're not deliberately excluding, and also that you're really listening to and taking account of what stakeholders, what the people that are affected by a thing, how they're experiencing it, rather than making assumptions. So both of those two things are important. And the way that we determine the way we're proposing to determine the level of completeness and accuracy that's appropriate for this within this standard is to make an assessment of the risk to the affected stakeholder of the type of decision that you're trying to make on the basis of the information. So you could have some very limited and sketchy information, but actually it's a pretty low risk activity, or you know, and risk, I think people often think of risk only in terms of negatives, but in some cases this could also be the risk of something positive not happening. So maybe there's something that stakeholders really want. There's an improvement that they really want to see, like maybe I'll just go back to the homeless example. Maybe there's a cohort who are really marginalized. They would really they really need a big change in their lives. But actually there's not really very proven ways of achieving that. So actually they might be willing to take a risk in terms of whether we can project that a particular thing that you're going to do to support them or to improve their lives, it might be less proven, and that might be absolutely fine, because actually they would quite like you to take that risk on it because it's worth it to them. So I think it's this is the basis of the decision, is to say how complete, how accurate do we need this information to be for the sake of the decision that we're going to take, and that's based on how a stakeholder would be affected. So what's the risk that they're taking on this?
Yeah, that's fascinating, and there's a good section in the guidance that I encourage everyone to read, really, because it is exploring risks as you say, in relation to decision making, which is exactly what we want people to be doing. And that breakdown of Rigor being both completeness of information and accuracy is a really, really helpful distinction, I find. And yeah, I look forward to hearing people's responses to that and how we can build out that a bit more. Thanks, Jenni. I think I'll take this slide because I wanted to just talk a little bit about, well, how does this standard help at all with the confusion that there seems to be in the market about which standards or approaches people should use? You know, we had a session a couple of months ago about the landscape of different standards. For me, I think this Principle 8 and this standard makes it much clearer what SVI is all about. It makes us more clearly a management approach, a decision-making framework. It makes things that very explicit, as Jenni was saying. And that then is useful when people then look at SVI's principles and standards alongside maybe the GRI standards, which are a reporting framework. And so people can very clearly see now, okay, this is what SVI are about. It's decision-making and optimizing impact and well-being for material stakeholders and different types of decision-making. So for me, I think it only helps position SVI as to where we are. And of course, we don't operate in a vacuum. We've been working closely, you know, SVI has been becoming more and more closer and in collaboration with obviously the UNDP and the SDG impact standards. And I think this is a natural kind of evolution and a convergence between what their standards do and what our standards do. And I'm sure we'll be doing more webinars on the, you know, relationship between these two standards. But, you know, in short, the SDG impact standards are building off of other standards and frameworks. So SVI standards are already sort of what's influencing those. And the fact that their standards are about managing impacts that contribute positively to sustainable development, they have stuff in there around setting ambitious targets, thresholds, and strategy. And so it's kind of natural that what we've done here is to kind of build some more standards that complement that. And just finally, that there are more and more decision-making frameworks that are emerging, whether it's the Capitals Coalition and the protocols they've got for making decisions about natural capital, social and human capital. These are decision-making frameworks, and we can now be seen as closer to those. Obviously, the British Standards Institute have got a guide for enhancing social value. And again, that's about enhancing, it's about making decisions to do that. So yeah, very much a management approach now, as opposed to previously when we've been pigeonholed or categorized as impact measurement. Okay, the moment you've all been waiting for. If you haven't already jumped to this bit in the document, this is, these next two slides are the standard that has been set as an aspirational standard of best practice for people to work towards. And I'll hand over to Jenni to talk us through these two slides.
Yeah, I'm trying to think how to make this fun. It's not, it's probably not easy. So without sort of just reading it line by line, the first thing really to say is, so I think you've already got the flavor. This is a management approach. That's what we're requiring in order to meet the standard. It's not just an accounting approach or a measurement approach. You also need to manage the impacts that you're having on society, on the well-being of material affected stakeholders in order to try to optimize them. So we then set out what the impact management approach should include, and that is these 5 things, which is firstly that you consider and schedule decisions so that they are such that they are timely and regular. So I already mentioned the example of, you know, not waiting to do something to reduce your carbon emissions till next year, because actually that's the most urgent thing facing the world at the moment. arguably, but anyway, that's just to give an example, that you would review the decisions that you're making on a regular basis, and that you're making decisions, you're not just making decisions to make sort of small tweaks. You're not just thinking, well, how could I improve this a little bit? How could I reduce the negative impact on this? How could I, using the decarbonisation, which happens to be the area I'm working in at the moment, so probably I'll come back to a lot of examples like that, but not just, you know, how can I, you know, important though that may be, how can I improve my boiler efficiency a notch? Important to do that, but actually, what, you know, strategically speaking, what can I do to make a significant step forward in terms of the decarbonisation of my operations? That would be, you know, we're trying to push people to think about this in terms of not just making incremental change, I guess is the point. And the tactical decision making, this is where, you know, I don't know if you wondered about the word optimize and why we've got that word in there, but really, I think that comes up a lot in the tactical decision making, because effectively what we're talking about is having to make decisions between, you know, trade-offs between, we could do this and that might have this type of effect on this set of stakeholders, or we could do this and that might have that sort of effect on that group of stakeholders. And actually, how do you compare those two things, and what are the trade-offs? So perhaps you're asking one stakeholder group to accept something that's maybe slightly less than optimal for them, or slightly less than perfect for them, in order for another stakeholder group to benefit. And so that's where we get into this idea of optimizing rather than, you know, maximizing, for example, because maximizing perhaps suggests that there would be one right solution to things. That you create mechanisms. So I've waffled on about point A. So point B says scheduling decision making, creating mechanisms for responding to the impact data. And I guess this is relatively straightforward. The point is, things don't happen unless somebody is responsible for them. You can't just, in a meeting, you can't just say, oh, somebody's dealing with it, otherwise nobody's going to deal with it. And so that's part of the management approach. We're explicit about that. That you prepare social value accounts to support internal decision making. And so that was, to what extent do you need to do that? Because I think people have said, oh, that sounds very, very onerous, and our organization's actually doing this already. And you know, and indeed that was like the first step, and that was where we started on this journey all those years ago, was let's just try and get people to do some social value accounts before you do something off the back of it. And so I think this is where the appropriate level of rigor and impact risk comes in, and that judgment about how complete, how accurate do you need to be for the decision that you're taking. And so we're not trying to measure absolutely everything absolutely perfectly. That would be impossible, and it wouldn't actually be helpful. We'd spend a lot of time and effort measuring stuff that really wouldn't make any difference. We wouldn't do anything differently as a result. But the social value accounts, to meet this standard, you have to prepare them by applying the other 7 principles. So that kind of makes sense. And I've just mentioned the thing about rigor and completeness and accuracy. And then moving on to being externally accountable, so that you would publish, so point D, you would publish annual social value reports, and furiously working out now a revised SVI report assurance standard, and the reports undergo appropriate verification before publication. So the point about this is, when you're making a claim, that somebody's had a look at it to say this is a valid claim. And then point E, continuous improvement of the impact management approach. So I think this is recognizing that, you know, this is a new standard, that there isn't maybe a huge amount of practice around this yet. Well, there isn't. and people can improve what they're doing over time. And certainly, I'm sure the standard will also improve over time, especially if we get feedback. But not to just say, well, our first attempt at it is right, but actually to have a think about how are the schedules of the, we're making decisions about this on this kind of schedule. We're focusing on these areas. These are the things that we thought were important to stakeholders. Is that still the case? Have we got the kind of the framework and the are we looking at the right kind of accounts? Are we have we got the right people as assigned to things? Oh, nothing's changed on one of these aspects, so do we need to get a different person to take responsibility for it? All of those kind of things. And so that's continuous improvement of the impact management approach, which is very common in sort of quality assurance standards as well. And then I'll try and get through the next bit a bit faster. So then secondly, making decisions to, so next slide, Ben. So this is so we've done the management approach, and then, so that's the sort of the framework that we're sitting this within. And then the key thing is, well, what decisions are you actually taking? What are you doing differently? What are you intending to do differently, at least? And then we've set that out in terms of these three types of decisions, so the strategic, the tactical, and the operational. And I think I've probably given a quite a reasonable kind of idea of why we've done that and kind of what's involved in that already. So I'm maybe not going to labor the point about that. But Ben, if you think.
No, I think you have. Yeah, been talking about those types of decisions throughout, but this is absolutely right. I just like to kind of point out the impact goals and impact thresholds and targets is really good to see, because we're all having some impact. But this is the first time we're actually asking people to say, are you having enough impact? Should you really be expecting to do more? And that's great to see.
Yes, and I suppose I haven't talked a lot about the thanks, Ben. So particularly in terms of the strategic decisions, setting the goal, I think previously we really didn't have anything in terms of how you might set goals. And what you'll see here is we've said to take account of two different things, one of which is what your stakeholders think, but of course your stakeholders may be marginalized, and so you might do all the best stakeholder engagement in the world, but they might not be able to imagine that things could be any better. And so this is where it's actually useful to have some reference to what has it been societally agreed that it's important to achieve. And so, for example, looking at the Sustainable Development Goals, and science-based targets when it comes to climate change and all of that kind of thing. So these are not, this is maybe not a straightforward kind of decision to be taking, and how these aspects are balanced, I think, is going to be really interesting to watch how people take this standard and what they actually do when they apply it. What are the judgments they're making between the relative importance of what stakeholders are telling them, and how are they translating what can often be quite vague and woolly goals at the level of a whole global society into things that are fast enough. How are they determining what a threshold is? How are they determining what a rate of change is necessary? What sort of rate of change is necessary? Now I definitely will shut up.
No, I was enjoying it. It's all interesting stuff, isn't it? And I suppose asking people to think a little bit more about, are we doing enough? Is that good enough? So yeah, I'm really excited. Love it. So one or two more slides and then over to your questions. So please do have them lined up. We'll come to you in a moment. Just wanted to talk about the implications for the standards, for the other principles, and for SVI assurance accreditation. Well, actually, we've mentioned it, that the task now, and that the methodology subcommittee will be leading, is to review how this principle and the thinking there should be incorporated into the other standards guidance for applying said principles. So, for example, principle number 1 involves stakeholders. There needs to be some reference now in involving stakeholders to this idea of goals and thresholds. You know, what do stakeholders think is a good enough change? And that is a really good example of how Principle 8 has a knock-on effect to how the other principles should be applied. So it is a process of doing that, and we'll be working to do that as quickly as possible. And anyone who wants to help us with that, please do let us know. But yeah, exciting times for the whole set of principles, really. And the Reporting and Assurance Technical Committee are really helping to think through what this means for the existing assurance requirements, you know, for a report. What do we expect in a report that's assured to include in relation to this decision making? And that's something that we're prioritizing right now. And of course, we do have the Social Value Management Certificate developed by Social Value UK that is all about systems and processes. So, you know, the two, that accreditation, that certificate is already touching on some of this. I think it's just a case of aligning all of the detail now that's been set out in Principle 8 into that Social Value Management Certificate if it hasn't already got those things in. So yeah, do bear with us and watch out for further changes. We are looking for examples of how this is being applied, how it can be applied, what is best practice. There are pockets of examples I've heard, you know, oh, in this company we do make these types of decisions and we record them in this way. So we're going to be collecting some of those, and we're keen to hear from you if you've got it in your own organization or seen that, and do help us. Do help us also just to share this standard and guidance, and we want this to be embedded in practice as quickly as possible. So there is a communications toolkit that we've developed with all the joint member networks helping to kind of get some nice marketing material. So if you're interested in helping us promote it to your networks and your audiences, do get in touch, and we'd be very happy to share that with you. So that concludes the slides that Jenny and I prepared. I hope that was useful and gave you a good introduction to the topic. And we have 20 minutes left now, so I've come off screen and not sharing my screen, and I'm happy to take any questions that you have. So yeah, the floor is open. Does anyone want to kick us off with a question or even a comment or reflection?
There are a couple of questions in the chat. I can read them out unless the people want to ask them themselves. But yeah, there was a question from Tim. How does the new principle align with the British standard guidance on social value?
Good question, Tim. I don't have a detailed answer to that, other than I know that standard talks about it's a guide for enhancing social value, not a guide for reporting or measurement of social value. So there are bits in that guide that talk about decision making and management. So I'm sorry I can't be a bit more detailed than that, but it's a really good question actually, and maybe that's a piece of work to do actually, to kind of map the alignment.
Yeah, I think there's aspects of that British standard that have influenced the way we were thinking about the development of this principle, and probably the development of this principle should maybe feed back into influencing that British standard.
Yeah, good point. Okay, thanks Fakir for flagging that one. Anyone else?
I'll read another one from Astrid because she has bad connection. So,
Okay.
Hi Jenny and Ben, how do we ensure that Principle 8 is embedded on the SROI report? If we include all the decisions made during the assessment, would it be too much? sorry for being too technical. Thank you.
Oh, Astrid, never apologize for the technical questions. You're in safe company here. We do like that question. So I'll go first, and Jenni maybe add in that the SRI report, if it's to meet assurance, already does include quite a lot of information around the judgments and the decisions that went into preparing the account. But we will be expecting a report to include some of the details of the decisions made or the recommendations made. There is a really interesting dilemma, I suppose, as to how many of those decisions we expect to be included in a report. What is feasible? Do we expect all decisions, strategic decisions, to be included? All tactical ones? All operational? That has not yet been decided, I'll be honest with you. It's going to be a tricky one to set. So yeah, Jenni, do you have any thoughts on that question?
I'm not sure I can add anything at the moment. I think it's something we're currently working through. Any thoughts on this? Very welcome.
So that the transparency standard for Principle 6 and report assurance is the next up, and that's one of the key questions for it, really. There has been some discussion around, confidentiality, and even it might not be appropriate for a business or an organization to reveal all of the decisions that they've taken. So that's something that we need to grapple with.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if is Astrid still there? Do you want to come back on that? Maybe not. Okay, Lucia, what's the next question?
There's also Jada who has her hand up, so I don't know if we'll go maybe first to Jada or.
Good idea. Hi, Jada. Do you want to unmute yourself?
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Jenni, for this great presentation. And thank you for encouraging technical questions, because I have also one. And I couldn't right now imagine how can we align with stakeholder involvement with this principle. Should we involve stakeholders while making decision about future steps? I cannot imagine that how we gonna do this right now.
Jenni, you want to take this one? Go first.
Yeah, I mean, I think organizations have all sorts of different practice around involving stakeholders. Some organizations go as far as co-designing their future activities with stakeholders. I don't think we're saying that you have to do that, but I think what we're saying is that you have to at least consider what it is that your stakeholders really would like to achieve. What would be a meaningful difference in terms of their well-being, and usually you can get that with reference to what they're currently experiencing. So that's a sort of a starting point, is probably to just do it on the back of an existing social value accounting process, social value reporting process. You're looking at what are you currently doing, what are the effects on your stakeholders, and as part of that you're also asking them about what it is they're really trying to achieve, or what would make a really significant difference in their lives. And as I said, I think, and this depends very much in what context we're talking about, because obviously a lot of social value practice to date has been in the not-for-profit profit world, the charity world, the that kind of the social enterprise world, and it's been largely about how do we take a marginalized group of stakeholders and improve their lives. And in that context, it probably makes sense to do more work with people. I've seen really great work with setting goals, but this is quite in-depth work, and not all organizations will have the ability to do that. And as I've talked about marginalized stakeholders, they maybe won't tell you. They maybe because they're suffering, they're struggling. You ask them what they want to see, what they would like to be different. They can't tell you. You can't imagine things being different. And this is where I think the kind of the reference point back to the societal targets becomes important. So what's kind of good practice? What else is out there that is really aspirational for that group if they can't express it themselves? And so it's a bit like how we do stakeholder involvement. I think it's very similar to how we do stakeholder involvement from the point of view of trying to figure out what's changed. It's like some groups, it's quite hard to get a sort of meaningful response from them in terms of what's changed, and you have to really be careful about the methods that you're using. Others will be able to tell you quite clearly what difference something's made to them. So I think it's similar with this. It's like we're saying, have a go at it, try and elicit a vision from people, but also triangulate that with what else you know. And ultimately, it's a judgment about what's the kind of best sense we've got from looking at these different sources, what stakeholders are telling us, and also what existing research effectively has already been done, or what goals have already been set in society, and then so what's the right thing to do there. I hope that wasn't too long an answer.
Yes, thank you so much. And it sounds Principle 8 will be milestone for impact assessment approach for any institution, because it tells us that it's a dynamic process, keep on going, not just reporting and close the book. I mean.
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you so much.
Perfect. Well said, Jada. Love that.
So there are a few more questions in the chat. Anna asks, why do you think organizations were not being very responsive, and what challenges will they have with implementing this standard?
Good question, Anna. Jenny, do you want to take either of those bits or half of the question?
Well, I think there's a lot of different reasons for why organizations have not historically all been that responsive. I think one of them is just because it was a kind of new concept, and almost this is like why we started with what are the 7 principles, how would you apply them to understanding the difference that you're making, and that in itself was quite enough for most people to try and get their head around. And it's also what was driving that was quite often, I guess, money. So what did funders want? What organizations buying solutions from other organizations, what did they want to, what kind of evidence did they want? And I think really this is a bit of maturity here, and it's also a bit of broadening out into other fields, because the more you engage with the corporate world, the more you've got to deal with, I'm not saying corporate, so the only organizations that have negative impacts, and I guess one of the reasons that one of the kind of key things in the principles was positive and negative impacts, that's what you're looking at all times. But I do think the broader set of impacts on society, it becomes more challenging when you're moving into the corporate. I'm not giving a very clear answer here, so I'm rambling. So why were organizations not being very responsive? I think just largely because it was new and because what was driving them. And I think what challenges will they have implementing this standard? think it will be challenging, and I don't think we should shy away from that. I think to meet the standard is quite difficult, but really in a way that's what we wanted to do, was to say, you know, there's no point if you're just going around creating a nice shiny marketing report that you can wave around. What's the point of that? We need urgent change on so many of the different indicators of prosperity and well-being in society. We need really urgent change. So, you know, actually setting a high standard that says you've really got to think about this, and you've really got to plan your approach, and you've really got to demonstrate how you're thinking about this, and how you're analysing this, and what decisions you're making, and who's responsible for it. I don't feel bad about that. I think I think, you know, we see already that organisations are moving in that direction, and they're starting to hold almost each other. You know, there's starting to be a bit more of a race to the top, rather than we're getting away from, you know, sort of marketing greenwash and spin to some extent, and better quality information, which was the first part. Like, let's have the 7 principles and let's get people using it. That's part of it. But I think also, you know, there's been huge changes in societal attitudes and kind of what's good enough. That's not evenly distributed across the world, I know, and I will now stop talking and hand over to Ben, because I've given you plenty of time to think of an answer to this one, Ben.
Yeah, no, food for thought. It's a great question, Anna. I think I was just thinking about, it will be challenging for organizations to not just measure, but go, this is our target, this is our goal, and change the mindset about it's no longer just good enough to measure what's happened in the past. Go, look, isn't that great? We created some impact. It's got to be completely framed in the idea, and the overriding question is, are we creating enough impact? Are we creating as much as we can do? And that is going to be challenging, because I think a lot of people are still in the idea of like, oh yeah, look, we created some impact. And we're like, yeah, of course you did, but was it enough? And getting this idea that the data that you need can be low rigor. I think I just saw in the comments up above, Nicola was saying about this idea that everything's got to be highly accurate is a problem. So we do need to embrace the fact that it's okay to have data that isn't very accurate, but it's still useful in some situations. I think changing the mindset on that is going to be hard, but if you can, I think it's going to be really good for organizations, and it will help them be more like responsive. Because the other bit of your question was like, why do I think organizations are not being very responsive? I think it's this idea that they don't think the data is good enough to use, and I just think they are making decisions. Organizations are always making decisions about trying to improve, but they're not doing it based on any data. And it's perhaps because they think the data has to be perfect before it gets used in a decision. So those are just my reflections to that. And I don't know if that is useful.
And some organisations have been responsive. I think that's the other thing to say.
Yeah.
Not everybody. So it's maybe informative to think about the ones that have you know, have set out to respond to both to the accounts that they've done and to setting themselves more and more ambitious goals, and what's driving that. And I think what we'll see is there will be more and more organisations that fall into that category. Yeah, what we need now, I think, is a few kind of pioneers in terms of taking this standard and applying it and feeding back what they're doing. Let's start a movement.
Good idea. We'll just take one more question, then I'll hand to Richard to close us out. So Gulin, did I pronounce your name correctly?
You pronounce my name perfectly, Ben. Thank you. Thank you. Hello from Turkey. Hi. Well, the thing is, I think, I don't have a question, but it's rather a comment about this principle. This is going to make the institutions from doing good to being good. And that's really the biggest challenge we have here. This was very open in my mind, as we work with Jada, and this was popping up a lot in our discussions, that now that we have created this report and calculated the SROI, what happens now? I mean, we have loads of advice embedded in the report, but what happens now? So this principle 8 is exactly coming into the right point, that we are really pushing the institutions to really being good in all interactions that they have, not regarding the projects or things we have evaluated for them, but the mindset. This is going to have a mindset shift. I have loads of questions about how we might make it happen, and make it practical or pragmatic for them, and how rigorous we should be in making them adopt this principle. Again, loads of questions, but I think we'll realize them as we make the attempt to adopt and work on this principle together.
Absolutely. Thanks, Gillian. And do you let us know how it goes in your conversation? Some of our members obviously work in organizations, some provide advice and consultancy too, and that's going to be interesting as a consultant when you're making recommendations and not actually making the decisions. So I'm looking forward to hearing how this
Gladly will do.
Good. Last minute, and sorry if we've not answered your questions. Seems like we'll probably be doing more on this. But Richard, I'm really glad you've joined. Richard's co-chair of the SVI board, and maybe if you just want to say some closing remarks.
Yeah, thanks, Ben, and obviously especially Jenny as well, and the Methodology Subcommittee. I know this has been a really hard task over a number of years, and it is momentous. We talked about the 7 principles, as Ben said, since 2007, but the Methodology Subcommittee convinced the board that actually we needed this new principle to be implemented, because it was becoming more and more important to be able to demonstrate that you don't just, as our previous speakers mentioned, you don't just do a report and then stick it on the shelf, but you actually have to change to then implement that and actually make it go wider through the organization. So I just want to really thank Jenny, Ben and the SVI team on a lot of hard work to get us to this point, and I hope this will now go out into the world and start to be implemented, not just by people like us, as Ben said, a safe space where we all love the technical detail, but where it gets implemented more broadly across the social sector and hopefully the corporate sector, so that we can start to realize that vision of social value international to change the way society accounts for value. And I think this principle is another step on the journey towards that vision becoming a reality.
Thanks, Richard. I'm really excited. I think the real hard work starts with everyone implementing it, but yeah, we have worked hard, and this has been great to talk about it today. So we'll close it out there. Hope you all have a nice rest of the day, evening, and thank you all for joining.